The emergence of the idea of the commercial intertext is arguably reflected in the changing industrial configuration of Hollywood since the 1970s. We've already seen the beginnings of this in the narrative of how Universal becomes part of a television company when MCA Productions takes over Universal Studios in 1962 and then turns itself basically into Universal Television. So you've got one company that is both a film company and a television company. Um, and what we see in the period from the 1970s up until around, I guess, the mid 1990s is a kind of a similar set of strategies being explored and exploited by all of the major studios. Um, and to the extent where in the 21st century, although many of the brand names that would have existed way back in the studio era in the 1940s still exist today, they are now far from being standalone entities, and they are much more at the core of kind of corporate entities that are involved in a range of parallel media enterprises simultaneously. We talked with regard to the studio system about the idea of vertical integration, so you had a single company operating at production, at distribution, and at exhibition. What has occurred since the 1970s is what you might refer to more as integration. So you've got a company that is a film company here, but is also a television company here, is a music publishing company here, a book publishing company here, has an online version over here. And what is being exploited here is, or what has been set up here is the opportunity to exploit cultural commodities which are potentially created in any one of those five divisions, or possibly more. But in film or television or comic books or music or online, whatever it might be. But I suppose film in particular is a kind of a crucial springboard for the creation of cultural commodities, which can then be exploited in these ancillary markets. And I mean, think about, say, the launch of Jaws back in 1975. Um, Jaws spins off lots of merchandising, but Jaws also triggers or spawns a very successful soundtrack album, the music of John Williams. So it made sense for Universal to license that record to its own music company, if indeed it had one, and it did at Universal Music. And as you'll see over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, companies which tend to be associated with Hollywood studios also end up becoming large players, in fact, the dominant players in the global music industry as well. So for a period at the start of the 20th century, the three big music players are Sony, are Warner's, and Universal, all also significant players in the movie business. So movies and music simultaneously. Although I will say that as of 2015, Warner's and Universal have actually sold off their music divisions. Universal Music and Warner still exist, but they're no longer associated with Universal Studios or Warner Brothers, or Time Warner rather. Sony, however, is involved in both of these. And we can sort of begin to get a sense of this, the scale of this, these synergistic corporate entities by taking a look at just actually how they break down, how these kind of vertical or how these horizontal alliances basically operate as of 2015. So let's go through these one by one. So if we look over here on the left hand side, we have Sony. Um, and Sony is now obviously a very significant player, not just in the hardware markets, where it has been a kind of dominant player globally for the past 30 years or so. Sorry, actually more than that, more like 40 or 50 years. But also it now owns MGM Studios, it owns Columbia Studios, and it owns United Artists, and is also one of the largest music publishing and music production companies on the face of the planet through Sony Music. Then we have what's happened to Paramount. Well, you can see it there in the middle of this red highlighted ones, kind of hidden behind the other elements of that empire. So Paramount is owned by Viacom, which in turn emerged as a television distribution company from the early 1970s. Viacom, in turn, is a subsidiary of National Amusements. National Amusements is one of the largest cinema chains in the United States. But Viacom, in addition to owning Paramount, which itself is not just a movie production studio, but is also a distributor, um, and it also owns Paramount Television, which is a television production company. It also owns its own television network in the form of CBS, which is still one of the four big networks in the United States. And outside network television in the United States, Viacom owns one of the largest and most successful cable channels, and that is obviously music television, or MTV. Then what's happened to Universal? Lew Wasserman's Universal. Well, in 2006, Universal and NBC basically merged together, and this occurs after a relatively unsuccessful takeover of Universal by a French utilities company called Vivendi. Although Universal, when they sold off, although Vivendi, when they sold off Universal, held on to elements of it, including, I think, both the online entertainment and basically the video game division, and possibly also the music division as well. But basically, since 2006, Universal and NBC have been one channel, and I guess that's kind of fitting, given that back in the 1960s, MCA Universal had been producing so much television for the NBC network. But both of those are subsidiaries of Comcast and General Electric. Comcast is the largest cable company operating in the United States. It owns 50% of NBC Universal, and General Electric owns the other 49%. Then we have Time Warner, which obviously owns Warner Brothers, but is the result of an amalgamation between Warner Communications and Time magazine in 1989. 11 years later, it would become, for a period at least, the largest communications and media group on the face of the planet, when Time Warner merged with the largest internet service provider in the United States, AOL, to become AOL Time Warner. And again, Warner Brothers is not just a film studio; it is also a very significant television player. Had fantastic 1990s with the success of the Friends sitcoms. So Warner Brothers International Television did really well out of that. It also owns its own network, albeit it's the weakest network in the United States. It's called the CW network. But it also owns what is arguably the most successful cable channel since the late 1990s, and that's Home Box Office, or HBO. Then there's Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, which starts off as a highly successful globe-spanning print and publishing operation, dominant player in the British, Australian, and to a much lesser extent, I suppose, the US newspaper and magazine publishing markets. In 1985, it buys out 20th Century Fox. 2 years later, in 1987, Rupert Murdoch, who has become an American citizen to facilitate this, because you have to be an American citizen to own US TV stations. In 1987, Rupert Murdoch buys something called the Metro Media group of stations across the United States. I think it's about 10 local stations in general. He rebrands those as the Fox Network, so they become affiliates, owned and operated affiliates to the Fox Network. And out of that, we get Fox Television. On top of all this, he acquires MySpace in the early part of this century. That turned out to be not the most successful investment he's ever made. He's also obviously involved in Sky. 39.1%, I think, of Sky is owned by News Corporation. And News Corporation also owns one of the 3 largest book publishers in the face of the planet, in the form of HarperCollins. And then finally, and it's very much last but not least, we have Disney. Disney, I suppose, isn't one of the major players during the studio era. It's an animation company, and almost exclusively that during the 1940s, 1950s. Wasn't even a major distributor in its own right. Its films were distributed on its behalf by RKO. And Disney has really kind of kept going during the 50s and 60s, not by its production output, which is relatively small scale and relatively infrequent, but instead it's its work for television, The Wonderful World of Disney, which actually it screens on ABC television during that period. So it's a hit show for kids. But it's also the theme parks. It's Disneyland, which arrives, I think, in 1954, and then later Disney World. And these will produce the kind of the cash cows, which keep producing revenues for the Disney Corporation through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's on that basis, actually, that Disney is able to basically revitalize itself come the 1980s, not least by its revival of the animation franchise in that period. So around films like, The Little Mermaid, The Lion King, even the less successful one, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And these are very good examples, actually, of commercial intertexts at work, because the princess, if you like, sequence of movies that Disney owns proves to be a very fruitful hunting ground for creating merchandising. Princess toys have a wander down the aisles of any local toy store. In 1993, Disney buys ABC, so buys its own network. And this leads to some really interesting examples of kind of these corporate synergies at work that I think are worth reflecting on for just a second. Disney is a company which has been incredibly active in the last 15 years in acquiring properties which lend themselves to exploitation in a kind of commercial intertext type fashion. Now, they begin this process in the 1990s, going after firms like Miramax Films, which had released Quentin Tarantino. They pick up Pixar subsequently. They've also got relationships with people like Merchant Ivory. You can just about see in the bottom left-hand corner there, James Merchant and Ismail Ivory. But I think the more interesting ones are the ones they've done really in the last 10 to 15 years or so. So in 2004, you have the acquisition of Jim Henson's hit television, Henson International Television, which basically gets Disney the Muppets. In 2009, you have the acquisition of Marvel Entertainment, so the whole lock, stock, and barrel of Marvel, which had already begun to demonstrate significant success with what is internally referred to as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So around films like Iron Man, I suppose, in particular. And then after beginning negotiations in May 2011, in 2012, Disney acquired Lucasfilm for about $4 billion. And I could focus on any of these, but I think Marvel's kind of the interesting one. Not least because of the enormous success of just that extraordinary sequence of films since basically around 2010, and I'm talking here not just about the kind of the Iron Man sequels, but I'm talking here about the Thor movies. I'm talking about Captain America, and of course the Avengers hits as well, which have been the biggest films basically of the last 5 years or so. But what is really interesting to me about the kind of the Marvel example is how that is exploited, not just in the world of film, but also in Disney's television arms as well. Because the Marvel Cinematic Universe is now also a Marvel televisual universe. The most obvious example of this, I suppose, is Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the TV series, which is basically commissioned by ABC, which Disney owns, of course, and becomes part of the kind of the American TV schedules from around 2013. That is subsequently followed by Agent Carter, and Agent Carter is a character who is originally introduced in, I think, the first Captain America movie, so the one that's initially set in the 1940s, and now she has her own TV series. And we have also seen Disney exploit other elements of the Marvel universe, albeit not on ABC, not for not for ABC's consumption or for ABC's distribution. You have things like Jennifer Jones, you have Daredevil, both of which have been constructed basically for Netflix. But in a way, Marvel is a very good fit with Disney because Disney has a long history of understanding merchandising. If you go back to the 1940s, the one piece of merchandising that you were very likely to see on the arms even of American soldiers was a Mickey Mouse watch. If you watch Mary Poppins in the 1960s, you could go into a local store. You could do this in Dublin. Dublin had a Mary Poppins display in Cleary's, and you could buy a Mary Poppins umbrella and other associated paraphernalia associated with the film. But it is very much the exploitation of the kind of the princess characters and the soft cuddly characters that Disney has been creating now for the guts of 70 odd years, that the company is expert at, and Marvel obviously lends itself very neatly to that. So a major attraction for Disney from the perspective of Marvel is the merchandising possibilities there, because for every Avengers movie you've got 5 or 6 ready-made characters which can slot straight into the shelves of your local toy store. So the industrial configuration, the kind of the corporate structure of Disney, which is simply an example, because this is basically the structure that all other major kind of cross-media, transmedia, commercial intertext focused media giants are focused on today, is something along the Disney model. So what they regard themselves now is as cultural commodity creators, and once you've created that cultural commodity in, for example, film, you then seek to exploit that across your business empire in as many different ways as possible.